Ted Schilowitz from Red, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Uma. Pleasure.
From Red. So,
it does have a bit of an aura around it, doesn't it? There's sort of a...
It does. I've never touched one before. I wanted to talk to you about cinema.
Okay.
And, you know, because you guys started off kind of out of nowhere, because I guess it was at that bridge when cinema was going into digital. Everyone still used traditional methods. But then you kind of proved that a company can come out of nowhere and make a camera that's just going to be incredible. Because no one challenges Sony, no one challenges Canon, no one takes them on. Where do you get the cojones to do that?
Well, it wasn't really our intention to challenge anyone. It was our intention to ensure that the transition from motion picture film into motion picture digital would be respectful and logical and of the quality that was required. And the electronic manufacturers, you mentioned a few of them, were not of the mindset or real understanding, at least in our opinion, that what was really needed was true image fidelity and not HD pictures and not electronic video cameras. There was a moment in time we call sort of the dark period between film starting to hit into its retirement age and digital starting to come into its own, that the manufacturers of television cameras, video cameras, were trying to sort of convince the cinema industry that HD level tools would be acceptable, would be enough to make that transition across.
Because it was only like Lucas and James Cameron really who were doing it at the time, was playing with it, right?
And you know, really what you saw was images that were a quarter or less than a quarter of the resolution of motion picture film, trying to sort of sneak their way into the cinema business, and it was a real problem. It was something that was going to be lost, of the true joy of high resolution images on people's eyes on a very large screen, and that was a real concern for the founder of our company, Jim, and I'm the first employee. So we started together, the two of us, on this odyssey, I guess you would call it, of ensuring that didn't happen. And we built our first camera, the Red 1, to prove that we could indeed carry on the proper legacy of high-resolution imaging that started with motion picture film and now lives in digital. And now, I guess we're about 6 years later. You know, we're 3 cameras in, and finally the rest of the industry has woken up from their slumber that HD would be okay, after Red has essentially taken over the cinema industry.
Because in 6 years, you're on every major motion picture.
Pretty much.
Prometheus, Spider-Man, Hobbit, using 60 of these. And Prometheus, I think, has some of the best visual grammar I've ever seen.
The visuals were stunning. I mean, just the quality of that work with these cameras, you know, in these specialized 3D rigs. And you see it on a giant screen in 3D, and there's just nothing like it.
So what does 4K mean in an era where, because, you know, the industry is kind of split in two, right? You've got a whole bunch of people creating stuff for mobile, and everyone's watching more and more on their tablets and their cell phones. And then you've got cinema displays at home, which keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Where do you guys fit in? Why do we need 4K resolution on something which is 4 inches long?
Good question.
Right?
So, in terms of the understanding of why we need high-resolution pictures, you actually go back to the days of analog film, where if you can start with a very, very large image canvas, right, and you have the resolution to then take and manipulate those images and deliver a high-quality image for any resolution device. So if you start with a fairly low-resolution image, you're locked in space and time, right? You've only committed to, say, the resolution of devices that are created at a certain time.
It's like throwing away a RAW and keeping your JPEGs, right?
To a certain extent, yes. It's a good example. So what we all know about the technology industry and the technology world is that nothing stays in place, right? So in just a few years, we've moved our resolution from one target to a target that's 60% higher than the first target, and the next target, another 6 months from now, will be another 50% higher than that. If you look at, like, pointing to laptop technology or these pad technologies, right? So in just a few years, the iPad doubled its resolution.
That's right.
The laptop screen that with their new 15-inch laptop just came out with a 5-megapixel 3K display on a laptop, right? So if you shoot material at 1080 or 720 or anything below real high fidelity imaging, which is 4K and above, you now have to upscale for today's pedestrian imaging devices, right? Everyone has an iPad.
Yeah.
An iPad is viewing higher than an HD image, right? And then there's a very large push in the cinema industry to move from HD or 2K displaying, which is effectively the same thing, to 4K imaging, right? All the major manufacturers are building and delivering 4K digital cinema devices into the industry, including Red, right? So we're building our own laser 4K projector. That's coming out.
So actually, so you guys are going into delivery as well, not just wow. And
we don't consider ourselves a camera company per se. We consider ourselves an imaging company.
Well, because you've got the word cinema in your company name. Right. But what does that mean? Or have you guys considered the way cinema is going? So, I mean, at the moment, there's a huge push for 3D. Almost every major release that's coming out, including The Great Gatsby, which is also shot on Red.
Phenomenal. Can't wait for people to see what this movie looks like. It is. I mean, between The Hobbit and The Great Gatsby, these are going to be visual experiences that people have yet to see in cinema. It's really incredible.
But 3D is still a pretty one-dimensional experience at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And will we reach this stage in time when we're going to be able to, look at different aspects of the film depending on where you sit in the cinema? I mean, is that something that's going to happen?
I think with digital technology and where we're sitting right now, we're just scratching the surface. I think within a few years, we're going to look back on the technology that we're doing now and the movies that are created now as a fairly primitive way to view things. Things start to move really fast when you apply computer logic into an industry, right? And up until Red came along in the industry of true cinema, digital cinema, you had a fairly antiquated system to create movies and then deliver them on a big screen, right? You're talking about analog acquisition and analog delivery on film.
Correct, yeah.
Which is wondrous in its own right, but it's also fairly historical, right? It didn't really migrate into the modern age, whereas everything else, if you look at a typewriter to an iPad, there's a huge leap of what an iPad can do, the 300,000 things an iPad can do versus the one thing a typewriter can do.
But how much does that have to do with actual movie-making techniques? Because I guess, directors are going to have to change their game.
Yeah, well, I think a lot. I think, when you apply sort of this technology accelerator, this computing engine accelerator to now the artistry and creative process of movie making, you have brand new ways of thinking about movies. Like you referred to The Hobbit. So Peter Jackson's using almost 60 of these cameras on The Hobbit, right? Which would just simply not be possible with film. It just the logic of it and the cost and the complexity would simply not be allowed. He's also shooting it at double the frame rate of a normal film. Yeah. And he's shooting it in 3D. So he's creating a whole new visual style and a whole new visual world based on the fact that these are not just cameras. They're very advanced computing engines applied to the camera world. This is a supercomputer, right? And everything we do with it, when you take it from the process of taking the media out of the camera, which is basically computer media, it's solid-state storage, and plugging it into an array of computers to process that and view it instantly, and then get it up on a 50, 100, 120-foot screen, effectively instantly. It's because it's computing, it's advanced computing. So, we do a lot in the education world, teaching people how to use these tools and how to work with these tools. Because when things are so radical and there's so much change going on, one of the most critical things you can do is educate people on
because they've got to keep up to date with what's going on.
Stuff,
absolutely. Right? Ted Schilowitz, we're using couple of Canons at the moment. We could really,
which are also little mini computers. They are, but not as powerful as this, but they're doing a fine job for capturing an interview.
They are, but we could really use some Scarletts.
We can arrange that.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.